Welcome to History 1, where the veils of the past are lifted and the whispers of forgotten thrones echo once more. If you find yourself drawn to secrets long buried, to mysteries etched in the shadows of palaces and castles, then subscribe and stay with us. What you're about to hear is not the polished tale of monarchs and crowns you learned in school. It is the unspoken history, the hidden chambers of Europe's nobility, where betrayal, forbidden love, and silent conspiracies shaped empires. Tonight's story is called The Whispered Thrones. They say kings ruled by divine right, that crowns were placed upon heads by the will of God. But what if I told you many crowns were stolen in the night, bought with whispered promises, sealed with blood spilled on cold marble floors? What if the glittering jewels of Europe's crowns were not merely treasures, but silent witnesses to centuries of deceit? The tale begins not in a palace banquet hall, but in a chamber so secret its stones were said to have absorbed the whispers of every monarch who ever feared betrayal. Few outside the court ever knew it existed. Beneath the gilded splendor of the royal residences, Madrid, Paris, Vienna, London, there ran a network of hidden rooms and passages. It was in these shadows that true power changed hands. The year was 1610. King Henry IV of France had been assassinated in Paris. Officially, it was the act of a fanatic, a lone man with a knife. But in the corridors of Europe's noble courts, another story circulated, of a pact whispered between Catholic cardinals, Spanish diplomats, and even Henry's own disaffected nobles. The widow, Marie de Medici, ascended as regent, yet behind her stood not only her ambitions, but the heavy hands of those unseen conspirators. What the people never learned was this: before Henry fell, a sealed letter had vanished from his desk, addressed to Elizabeth I, of England's successor, King James I. The letter spoke of a secret alliance, a pact to balance the power of Spain and Rome. But it never reached England. It was intercepted by a courier who, by all accounts, disappeared forever. Some whispered his bones lay beneath the Seine. Others claimed he lived on, carrying the letter across Europe, hunted like a ghost by spies and assassins. But France was not alone in its shadowed intrigues. For in England itself, James I sat uneasy upon a throne, still haunted by whispers of Elizabeth's rule. His court was plagued with rumors that nobles had plotted to replace him, that hidden Catholic sympathizers sought to restore Rome's authority. The gunpowder plot of 1605 was only the fire that nearly consumed Parliament. Beneath it smoldered networks of secret oaths, some reaching into the very households of the nobility. And in the midst of it all, in these secret dealings, there existed something never recorded in the histories, but passed on in private journals, locked in dusty trunks hidden away, the Council of Silence. They were not kings, queens, or emperors, but those who whispered into their ears. Powerful noble families across Europe, Habsburgs, Bourbons, Medicis, and Tudors, were tied not only by blood and marriage, but by an unseen covenant. They met in clandestine chambers, not to debate openly, but to decide which monarchs lived, which fell, and how the map of Europe would be drawn long before wars were fought. Their symbol was not a crown, but a mask. Few could prove their existence, yet time and again, deaths, disappearances, and sudden shifts of power aligned with rumors of their unseen hand. The council's true weapon was silence, so effective that only fragments of their story survive today, fragments hidden within coded letters, broken wax seals, and memoirs never meant to be read by the public. And so, The Whispered Thrones begins here, in the shadows of royal courts, where the clash of steel mattered less than the sound of a hushed voice in the right ear. What follows is not the story of nations, but of secrets that shaped nations. Would you like to hear how these whispers began to shape dynasties? How kings and queens bowed not only to the will of God, but to hidden promises forged in silence? The whispers begin, not in the radiant halls of Versailles or St. James's Palace, but in a darkened chamber beneath Vienna in 1623. The air smelled of candle wax and damp stone. 5 men sat around an oak table, their faces half hidden in shadow. No heralds announced them. No chronicler wrote their names. Yet they were among the most powerful men in Europe. Princes without crowns, nobles with fortunes that rivaled kingdoms, and cardinals whose words could move armies. This was no council summoned by the emperor. This was the council of silence. At their center lay a parchment map of Europe. Tiny marks in ink dotted its surface: Paris, Madrid, London, Prague, and Constantinople. Each mark was not a city, but a node in their network of influence. A velvet pouch rested atop the map, filled not with gold, but with rings, signets belonging to men who had sworn loyalty to the council. With these seals, they could send letters that carried the weight of monarchs themselves. One man, cloaked in black, leaned forward. His words were never recorded, but a memoir written decades later by a Spanish diplomat hinted at the matter they discussed: a marriage to end wars and begin others. The Habsburgs of Austria sought to bind Spain more tightly to their line, yet France opposed it. War loomed, but the council had other plans. If they arranged a marriage between certain heirs, they could steer Europe into a balance more favorable to themselves, not to any crown. It was in this very meeting, so the memoir claimed, that the idea of uniting Charles of Austria with Isabella of Bourbon was first whispered. The match never took place. France moved swiftly to prevent it. But the attempt revealed the council's power. They were not merely influencing politics. They were scripting it, arranging dynasties like pieces on a chessboard. But the most unsettling part was not what they plotted, but what they concealed. Hidden beneath their maps and marriage contracts was a secret long whispered among old noble families: the existence of a child who should never have lived. In Paris, rumors told of a boy born not to peasants, but to a queen. Some said Catherine de' Medici herself had arranged his concealment decades earlier. Others claimed he was the bastard son of a French monarch, hidden to preserve legitimacy. Whatever the truth, the council knew that his bloodline, if revealed, could fracture France. He would have a stronger claim to the throne than even Louis XIII. The boy vanished into legend, but the council never lost track of him. In letters between Spanish courtiers, phrases appear: the shadow prince, the bastard heir. Some claimed he was taken into Spain under a false name, others that he was spirited away to Italy to be raised among monks. Yet every noble at that table knew, if this prince were ever unveiled, France itself might split apart. The ordinary people, of course, never heard these whispers. They were told tales of divine kingship, of crowns passed in glory from father to son. But beneath that gilded story ran a darker truth, that Europe's destiny sometimes rested not in coronations, but in secrets buried alive. As decades passed, the council's hand grew stronger. Wars of religion raged across Europe, but for every battle fought in daylight, a dozen decisions had already been made in candle-lit chambers. Armies marched, kings bled, but the whispers shaped who would rise from the ashes. And then came a shift. In 1643, Louis XIV, the Sun King, ascended the throne of France at the age of 4. Officially, his mother, Anne of Austria, ruled as regent, guided by Cardinal Mazarin. But in truth, the Council of Silence returned to their secret table, debating whether France's future brilliance would serve them or destroy them. For the boy king was not meant to live. His survival itself was a defiance of whispered plans, and some suspected Anne had struck her own secret bargains to protect him. Europe watched a child grow into a monarch who would one day say, "L'État, c'est moi." Yet in the hidden corners of Versailles, rumors persisted that Louis's very life had been shadowed by doubles, that another child had been swapped in infancy, that the true heir of France might even have been imprisoned for the rest of his life. The council knew the truth. They always did. But they would never speak it aloud. Would you like to hear what became of this other heir, and how the whispers of his existence haunted Louis XIV's reign like a phantom at the banquet of kings? The tale of the other heir began in hushed tones, murmured among servants who feared their words might reach ears too powerful to forgive them. In the shadowed halls of Versailles, where mirrors reflected only what the crown wished to show, the whispers spoke of two infants born beneath the same roof, one destined to become Louis XIV, the other destined never to be seen. Some claimed the Queen, Anne of Austria, had borne twins in 1638. Officially, history records only one, the long-awaited Dauphin, a child hailed as France's salvation after 20 years of barrenness. Yet scattered notes in midwives' diaries, hints in the letters of courtiers, even fragments of Spanish diplomatic reports tell another story, that a second child, a boy, entered the world that night. Why was his existence denied? Because twins were considered a dangerous omen. The fear was not simply superstition, it was dynastic terror. Two sons born of the Queen meant two claimants. Which would be the true heir? Rival factions within France's nobility could have torn the kingdom apart, each backing their chosen prince. The solution, whispered only to a chosen few, was silence. One child was declared dead at birth, his existence erased with a stroke of a pen. But the truth? He lived. Where was he taken? That is where the tale fractures into shadows. Some say the boy was spirited away under the watch of Cardinal Mazarin, hidden in a remote chateau, raised not as a prince but as a shadow of one. Others insist he was sent to the Bastille, where he grew into a man whose face bore too striking a resemblance to the king's. And so emerged the legend of the man in the iron mask. Voltaire, writing a century later, hinted at this in his accounts. He described a mysterious prisoner, kept in the strictest secrecy, his identity veiled by a mask said to be iron, though in truth it was velvet. The jailers treated him with deference, as though he were not a criminal, but someone whose very existence threatened the state. Was this the lost twin? Many believed so. For who else could require such silence, such erasure from history, unless he bore a claim equal to the Sun King himself? The Council of Silence, of course, knew the truth. Their correspondence, pieced together by historians from fragments hidden in private archives, reveals their concern. If the twin were ever revealed, France might split into two rival thrones, one loyal to Louis XIV, the other to his brother. And in such a split, Spain, Austria, or England could exploit the fracture. But here lies the most chilling whisper. According to certain letters, Louis himself knew. From youth, he had been told the story of a shadow brother, one who might one day rise to challenge him. The knowledge haunted him, shaping the paranoia that defined his rule. Every noble who fell from favor, every minister accused of treachery, every conspiracy crushed with merciless force, Behind them all lurked Louis's fear that his brother's name might be invoked. Yet the council had no desire to see the Shadow Prince reign. A king who believed himself born by divine right was far easier to manipulate than a rival, claimant with a grievance. So they chose silence. They allowed the mask to remain, the prisoner to waste away in secrecy, until the world forgot he had ever been born. But whispers have a way of surviving. Servants who saw too much, jailers who heard too much, nobles who guessed too much, each carried the secret into the next century. And so, even as Louis XIV declared himself the very embodiment of France, there was always another presence at his side, unseen but never absent, the knowledge that his throne might, by rights, belong to another. Imagine Versailles at night, the golden halls quiet, the courtiers gone, the king alone in his chamber. In the stillness, did he ever hear the echo of his brother's breath, the rustle of chains in some distant cell? Did the Sun King, for all his splendor, live under the shadow of a stolen throne? Would you like to hear how this hidden lineage, buried beneath masks and lies, continued to haunt not only Louis but his successors, and how it shaped the bloody destiny of France itself? The whispers of a hidden heir did not die with Louis XIV. Instead, they slithered through the gilded corridors of Versailles, lurking in the minds of those who followed him. When Louis XV took the throne as a child in 1715, inheriting both crown and kingdom, he also inherited a shadow, the unspoken legacy of the erased twin. Louis XV grew up surrounded by guardians who reminded him of his grandfather's glory, but also of his grandfather's fear. Hidden in his tutor's records are curious notes, small warnings. The young king must never be left unwatched. Some historians believe this caution was not about protecting him from assassins, but from whispers. Whispers that one day someone might arrive claiming his throne by blood, a man once concealed, perhaps still alive, perhaps with sons of his own. The Council of Silence, though quieter in this century, remained alive. Nobles who sat at its hidden table understood the danger of ghosts. A king who reigned under doubt was easier to manipulate than one untouchable. And so they nurtured the myth of the iron-masked man, never fully confirming nor denying his existence, letting the people's imagination carry the burden of fear. But the whispers grew teeth. In Parisian taverns, talk of the man in the iron mask was not idle entertainment. To many, he represented the corruption of monarchy itself, a symbol that the Bourbons were willing to imprison their own blood to protect power. Revolutionaries in later years would seize upon this tale as evidence of tyranny. They would cry, "If a king can hide his own brother, what else might he hide from his people?" And indeed, there were other secrets. For the French court of the 18th century was a nest of concealed scandals. Children born in convents who bore the faces of dukes, secret contracts between noble houses that promised power in exchange for silence, even mysterious deaths that were never fully explained. Take, for instance, the sudden collapse of Louis XV's chief mistress, Madame de Pompadour. Officially, she succumbed to illness. Yet some accounts suggest she knew too much. Letters passed into her hands, correspondence between Austrian nobles and French ministers hinting that certain erased heirs had descendants in Vienna. Could it be that the bloodline of the Shadow Prince lived on, not in France, but across Europe? There is a letter, written in 1749 by an Austrian count, which survives in fragments. It speaks cryptically. The branch not acknowledged still grows. It bears fruit in silence, and one day the fruit shall be harvested. Who was this branch? Was it a direct reference to the lost twin of Louis XIV, or to another concealed child, born of royalty, but denied recognition? Louis XV himself was said to be troubled by visions, nightmares of masked figures entering his chamber. He would wake in terror, clutching at his crown as if it might be stolen from his head. His courtiers laughed it off as superstition, yet servants whispered that the king's dreams were not dreams at all, but memories whispered into his ears by secret advisers, warnings that the Council of Silence had not forgotten his family's bargain. By the time Louis XVI inherited the throne, the whispers had fermented into poison. The monarchy stood on fragile ground, hated for its extravagance, mistrusted for its secrecy. And in the chaos of the revolution, as heads rolled in Paris, pamphlets once again spoke of the hidden brother. Some revolutionaries declared, "Why kill one Bourbon when another waits in chains?" Others went further, insisting that the revolution itself was not simply the people's will, but the long-awaited vengeance of a forgotten bloodline. Here is the most chilling thought. When Louis XVI mounted the scaffold in 1793, he turned to the crowd and declared himself innocent of treason. But what if, deep in his heart, his terror was not of the guillotine, but of the shadow that had haunted his family for generations? What if, as the blade fell, his last thought was of the iron mask, of the brother whose existence had been buried but never erased? History records only what can be proven. But the whispers tell us that the revolution may not only have been born from hunger and injustice, but from a secret so dangerous that even kings trembled before it. Would you like to hear how this bloodline, tangled in secrecy, found its way beyond France, into the courts of Spain, Austria, and even Britain, where whispers of stolen heirs and masked princes threatened other thrones in turn? When the guillotine silenced Louis XVI, one might think the whispers of hidden heirs would fade into the roar of revolution. But secrets do not die with kings. They travel, carried across borders in coded letters, in the mouths of fleeing nobles, in the prayers of exiled queens. Marie Antoinette, in her final days, was said to murmur strange things to her jailers. A priest recorded that she spoke of those who wear no crowns yet command kings, and of a bloodline that runs like a shadow beneath Europe. At the time, her words were dismissed as the delirium of despair. Yet later, exiled aristocrats claimed she hinted at something more, that the erased lineage of the Bourbons had survived, not in France, but hidden within the courts of Spain and Austria. For the Council of Silence had not perished with Versailles. Its members were not tied to a single throne, but to the continuity of nobility itself. As France burned, they moved their influence quietly into Madrid, Vienna, and even London, and wherever they went, the whispers followed. In Spain, rumors spread of a Bourbon child sent from France years before the Revolution, raised under another name. He appeared at court briefly, a youth with uncanny resemblance to the French line, only to vanish from the records as though he had never lived. Some whispered he was smuggled into the monasteries of Toledo, where his descendants might still linger, cloaked in silence. In Austria, the Habsburg court was rife with paranoia. After Marie Antoinette's execution, pamphlets circulated suggesting she had borne a secret child in her youth, hidden away before her marriage to Louis XVI. If true, that child, Austrian by birth, Bourbon by blood, could claim two thrones at once. The mere suggestion was enough to unnerve both Vienna and the remnants of the French nobility in exile. But it was Britain where the whispers struck deepest. For across the Channel, in the smoky drawing rooms of London, exiled French aristocrats spoke of a pact made long before, between the Bourbons and the Stuarts. The Stuarts, deposed in 1688, still had sympathizers in Scotland and Ireland. What if, they whispered, the lost Bourbon heir and the lost Stuart cause could unite? What if a single prince could claim both France and Britain? The very thought terrified George III's ministers. They feared uprisings in Ireland, Jacobite plots in the Highlands, and French émigrés conspiring in London's taverns. So much so that British intelligence began a quiet hunt for this phantom prince, searching records in convents, monasteries, and noble houses across Europe. Officially, they found nothing. Unofficially, certain reports were sealed, never released to the public. One such report, surviving only in fragments, speaks of a man arrested in Venice in 1797. He carried forged papers but spoke fluent French, Spanish, and English, and bore a ring with the Bourbon fleur-de-lis. Witnesses swore his face was striking, too striking for an ordinary man. Yet after his arrest, he was never seen again. Some believe he was executed in secret. Others insist he was taken into British custody and lived out his life under another name, his identity buried with him. By the dawn of the 19th century, Europe had crowned new emperors and kings. Napoleon in France restored Bourbons after Waterloo. But the whispers endured. They lingered in songs, in tavern tales, in the private letters of nobles who feared that one day a man would appear at their gates with a face too familiar to deny. And perhaps that was the council's greatest triumph, for whether or not the shadow heirs lived, whether or not they claimed thrones, the fear of them shaped politics as surely as armies and treaties. Ministers acted in caution, kings in paranoia, revolutions in suspicion, all haunted by the idea that somewhere, in some hidden chamber, the rightful heir still breathed. Imagine a Europe where no monarch could sleep without wondering if tomorrow a masked man or a secret child grown into adulthood might appear to challenge their legitimacy. Imagine thrones built not on stability, but on silence. That is why the story of the whispered thrones is not about one king, one queen, or one nation. It is about the power of secrets themselves, the way silence can rule as strongly as crowns, and the way hidden bloodlines, whether real or imagined, can shape the destiny of empires. Would you like me to unravel how the Council of Silence moved into the 19th century, steering through the Napoleonic Wars and beyond, still guarding the shadows of Europe's nobility? Napoleon Bonaparte fancied himself the breaker of dynasties, the man who toppled the ancient thrones of Europe. But even he, the emperor who crowned himself before the Pope, could not escape the whispers. In the salons of Paris, behind the heavy curtains of Vienna, in the smoke-filled parlors of London, voices murmured, "He wars against kings, but what of the kings never crowned? What of those buried in silence?" The Council of Silence, far from being destroyed by revolution, adapted. For centuries they had manipulated monarchs, but Napoleon was something different. A soldier risen from obscurity, not born to the throne. Some among the council saw him as an opportunity. He had married Marie Louise of Austria, linking himself to the Habsburgs. If his blood mingled with theirs, might they steer even this self-made emperor into their long designs? Others, however, whispered that Napoleon's rise was too dangerous, that he threatened not only thrones, but the very art of silence. During Napoleon's campaigns, curious things occurred. Dispatches went missing. Secret envoys disappeared. Treaties were altered at the last moment. In Spain, Bourbon loyalists spoke of letters from a hidden branch promising that Napoleon would fall and the rightful line would return. In Vienna, Austrian officials noted the appearance of men who claimed descent from forgotten princes and offered their loyalty to Napoleon, hoping he might restore their lost thrones. Whether these men were impostors or true heirs, no one could say. But the council, in their hidden chambers, knew their danger lay not in their swords, but in their names. It was during this time that the most haunting rumor surfaced, that Napoleon himself had been approached by envoys of the council who whispered into his ear the story of the Shadow Prince of France. According to one account, Napoleon laughed at them, saying, "France has no need of phantoms. I am the heir now." Yet another report, buried in the memoirs of one of his ministers, suggests he took the tale seriously enough to order the secret search of French prisons and monasteries, hunting for traces of the Iron Mask. Nothing official was ever found, but whispers tell us Napoleon's men did find a skeleton in a hidden cell beneath the Bastille ruins, a man buried without a name, his skull still encased in a velvet mask. Whether it was real or a planted relic by the council, it served its purpose. Napoleon grew wary, paranoid, as though he feared not only the coalitions of Europe, but the invisible hands that had guided crowns for centuries. When the emperor finally fell, cast down in 1815, the Congress of Vienna convened to restore order. Officially, they restored monarchies, Bourbons in France, Habsburgs in Austria, and so forth. Unofficially, the Council of Silence was there, not seated at the polished table under chandeliers, but in the private chambers where deals were struck behind closed doors. Who would rule which lands? Which bloodline would be restored? Which forgotten prince would remain forgotten? These decisions bore their fingerprints. And here lies the most unsettling twist. Among the many papers circulated at Vienna, one draft, later suppressed, suggested the possibility of uniting Europe under a single federal crown. The draft bore no official signature, but at the margins, one symbol repeated: a mask. The suggestion was never taken seriously by kings and emperors, but its very existence revealed that some dreamed of a Europe ruled not by many thrones, but by one, perhaps under a prince still hidden in silence. As the 19th century marched on, revolutions flared again, 1830, 1848, each time shaking monarchies, each time reviving old whispers. Pamphlets appeared in Paris and Madrid, claiming the true Bourbon line has not died. In Italy, revolutionaries carried banners hinting at a king denied his crown. Whether these were the work of agitators or of the council stoking fire, no one could prove. But one thing is certain: the nobility never fully escaped the whispers. Even Queen Victoria of Britain, secure in her empire, once remarked to her ministers, "Every throne in Europe is haunted." She had heard the stories too: the shadow princes, the iron masks, the heirs erased but never entirely destroyed. And if the Council of Silence survived into the modern age, as some suspect, then the whispered thrones did not end with the guillotine or at Waterloo. They endured, shaping politics in ways never written in history books, but always lurking just beneath the surface of Europe's glittering crowns. Would you like me to carry this story into its final passages? How the whispers lingered into the twilight of monarchies in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and how echoes of the council may still be heard even today? The 19th century drew its curtains across Europe in velvet and smoke. Monarchies rose again after revolutions, only to tremble under new unrest, and always like a chill draft through the golden halls came the whispers: the forgotten heirs still walk among us. By mid-century, Paris had remade itself under Napoleon III, yet his reign was stalked by rumors no less than his uncle's. Secret societies circulated pamphlets claiming that the true Bourbon king still lived, hidden away since the Revolution. The Orléans line feared these whispers, for their legitimacy rested on fragile acceptance. Even Napoleon III himself, though draped in imperial pomp, was unsettled enough to order his police to suppress any talk of shadow heirs. Files discovered in French archives mention investigations into men of noble aspect appearing in provincial towns, stirring talk of restoration before vanishing without trace. And it was not France alone. In Spain, the Carlist Wars erupted, civil conflicts that tore the country apart. On the surface, they were disputes over succession laws, but beneath, many believed they were fueled by the same whispers that had haunted Versailles, that hidden princes, erased by politics, were being invoked as banners for rebellion. Priests, peasants, and nobles alike swore oaths to names never officially recognized, to fight for a king that might not exist. That was the power of the whisper. The Council of Silence by now had taken on an almost spectral identity. Its members were not known. Perhaps they were not even the same families as before. But evidence suggests their hand lingered. Letters from the Austrian archives mention the masked council, consulted in 1848 when revolutions spread like wildfire. Who were these men, or women, so influential that ministers sought their approval before negotiating with rebels? No historian can say for certain, yet the phrase recurs. Silence must be maintained. In Britain, the whispers were softer, but no less dangerous. Queen Victoria's reign was stable, yet she too heard rumors of Jacobite heirs, descendants of the Stuart line, still whispered about in Scottish Highlands taverns. Some claimed the council protected them, ensuring they would never rise, yet also never entirely disappear. Was this why Victoria spoke so often of her anxieties for the throne, despite her popularity? She knew that behind the loyalty of her subjects lay centuries of silenced claims, waiting like embers. And then came the dawn of the 20th century, when monarchies seemed unshakable in their pageantry, yet within a few decades they crumbled. The Russian Tsar, the German Kaiser, the Austro-Hungarian Emperor, all swept away by war and revolution. But here is the unsettling thought. Some contemporaries whispered that these collapses were not simply the work of armies or ideologies, but of secrets finally surfacing. In Russia, as the Romanovs fell, stories emerged of impostors, men and women claiming to be hidden children of the royal line. Anna Anderson, the supposed Anastasia, is the most famous. But beneath the sensationalism lay a deeper whisper, that even the mighty czars might not be secure in their bloodlines, that somewhere forgotten heirs might yet lay claim. And in Vienna, as the Habsburgs surrendered their empire, archivists reported entire files missing from centuries past. Files concerning marriages never acknowledged, births never recorded, contracts never signed in daylight. Did the Council of Silence, facing the end of monarchy, erase its own traces? Or did it simply move into new forms, no longer whispering in palaces, but in parliaments, banks, and boardrooms? The age of kings may have dimmed, but the whispers did not. Even today, stories persist. In France, claimants still emerge, declaring themselves rightful heirs of the Bourbons or Bonapartes. In Spain, disputes over succession echo faintly of the Carlist cries. In Britain, conspiracy theorists murmur of hidden Stuarts. And always, somewhere in the background, one phrase returns in old letters and fading memoirs. The council has decided. Perhaps the greatest secret of the nobility is not their wealth, their jewels, or their palaces. It is their ability to bury truths so deeply that centuries cannot unearth them. Yet the stones of castles remember. The halls of Versailles, Schönbrunn, Windsor, and the Escorial all have absorbed centuries of whispers. So, when you next see a crown in a museum, glittering under glass, remember, it is not only gold and gems you are looking at, it is a relic of secrets, of forgotten heirs, masked prisoners, vanished children, and councils that ruled without thrones. And thus ends the tale of the whispered thrones, a history not of what was spoken aloud, but of what was never meant to be heard.